Welcome to this video produced by the Global Scholars Network on Identity and Conflict, a partnership between the Weatherhead Center at Harvard University and the Mitchell Institute at Queen's University Belfast. I'm absolutely delighted that our guest today is Rory Montgomery, a distinguished former Irish diplomat and an honorary professor of practice here at the Mitchell Institute at Queen's University in Belfast. Rory, you worked for a long time on Northern Irish affairs and on Irish-British relations, and you were deeply involved in the peace process in Northern Ireland, a member of the Irish team which negotiated the 1998 Belfast Good Friday Agreement. Drawing on that experience, I wonder if I could ask you first a question about the importance, as peace was developing in the North, the importance of public opinion, the importance of what the public actually wanted and actually needed here in Northern Ireland, here in the North. Could you offer some reflections on that?
Well, thank you, Richard, and I'm really delighted to have this chance to talk to you. I think one thing that's very important to remember from the very beginning is that violence in Northern Ireland was never unconstrained. I mean, it wasn't remotely equivalent to what happened in the Balkans, for example, in the 1990s. And in a way, you can say that the social license afforded even to paramilitaries on both sides was by no means absolute. And for that, you would have to say the churches, trade unions, what we would now call civil society, all had an impact on that and were responsible in part and deserve credit for the fact that things did not spiral into chaos. And the system of government kept working, the schools stayed open, social welfare was paid, and so on and so forth. Having said that, though, the peace process was, for a very large part of the time, an elite-driven project. Public opinion, in the end, maybe didn't matter that much, although, of course, became crucially important when it came to ratifying the agreement in the two referenda. Even a month before the deal was done, an opinion poll suggested that only about 10% of the population believed that the deal would be done. Now, it's paradoxical because I think almost everybody wanted peace. But of course, what did they mean by peace? And it was clear that I think the majority of nationalist opinion, as represented by the SDLP, was probably anxious to see peace. I won't say at any price, but for them, that was the overwhelming motivation they had, and they knew the importance of partnership and accommodation. But there were real doubts, I think, about whether Republicans, Sinn Féin and the IRA on the one hand, or whether Unionists, whether the DUP or the UUP, would actually be prepared to accept the kind of compromises which any conceivable peace would involve. So it became, it was by no means certain, despite the broad public support for peace, that the outcome would be as it was.
Thank you, Rory. And you mentioned elite level work there. And in the 1990s, during the building up to and the reaching of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement in 1998, there were strong relations built between the Irish and UK governments. There were strong personal and institutional relationships built up. Could you see something about how important that framework was of governmental cooperation for the building of peace in relation to the North?
Yes, it was absolutely fundamental. First of all, at the start of the Troubles in 1969, the British government did not believe that the Irish government had any entitlement to be involved in the affairs of Northern Ireland, which was seen as an internal matter for the UK. Equally, the Irish government at that time had a position in line with public opinion whereby it opposed violence, but still believed that the fundamental root of the problem was the partition of Ireland and British rule in Northern Ireland. And those two perceptions changed relatively quickly under the pressure of events. Cooperation began as early as the 1970s, early 70s. The Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985 was extremely important. It followed a very detailed and intense negotiation and gave the Irish government a formal consultative role in the affairs of Northern Ireland. And in a way, that partnership endured. There were difficulties along the way, no question about it. There were differences of approach and differences of view. But I think the two governments realised that there would be no peace if the two of them were not, broadly speaking, singing from the same hymn sheet. And I suppose when it comes to the peace process as such, two fundamentally important moments. The first was agreement on the so-called Downing Street Declaration in 1993, which set out the broad parameters, if you like, of a future agreement, but also set out the conditions which would need to be met by paramilitaries if they were to be admitted to talks. And secondly, then, there was literally a so-called framework agreement in early 95, which set out in more detail what an agreement might look like. So the two governments played a really important role, I think, in constructing the intellectual framework for the negotiations as such, even though others were really important when they came to aspects of the substance. I think a further point is that the two governments both had, resources, human resources, financial resources, diplomatic resources, which were by no means open to or similar to those which the parties would have had. And secondly, I suppose always a certain tendency to think, and not unreasonably, that the British government was in a way particularly sensitive to the concerns of unionists. The Irish government was particularly concerned with the interests of nationalists. And in a way, in the choreography of negotiations, as I saw myself, each side could kind of assume that its point would be put, but that the points of the other side would be put, would in a kind of reverse way and be set out as well, reaching a kind of synthesis.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful. And moving from the UK-Irish dynamics to wider international dynamics, people often, when looking at conflict resolution, talk about the importance of there being benign international engagement and a benign international framework. In terms of the peace process in Northern Ireland, what's your reading, Rory, of how significant international elements, international players and international contexts were in the achievement of peace in the North?
I think the peace process was above all a product of Northern Ireland itself and of the two islands, of the two governments, as I mentioned. But that's not to say that some external actors didn't play a very important part. And I think timing is interesting. I think a lot of participants said at the time and have said since that the examples which were set in the early 1990s of overcoming intractable conflicts or appearing to overcome intractable conflicts elsewhere, in particular in the Middle East with the Oslo Accords and in South Africa with the end of apartheid, that those examples were actually extremely important in showing what could be done and learning some of the lessons of those processes. Clearly, the United States had a particularly relevant role. Again, historically, the United States had always stayed well away from anything to do with Northern Ireland, right up to the presidency of Jimmy Carter, who, working closely with the Irish government, or the Irish government working closely with the National Security Council, a declaration was produced in 1977 saying that the United States stood ready to assist in any way it could. And that remained a sort of a bipartisan US approach thereafter. And even though people mostly talk about Democratic leaders, Ronald Reagan, for example, had a certain role in pushing Margaret Thatcher to agree the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985 that I mentioned. Coming, though, closer to the actual events, undoubtedly the election of Bill Clinton was a crucial moment because Bill Clinton had a personal interest in Northern Ireland. He had been a student at Oxford during the beginnings of the Troubles, and his own personal involvement and engagement could be crucial at certain points, in particular towards the very end of the talks themselves, in encouraging compromises to be done. And also his famous visit to Northern Ireland in 1996 was a dramatic demonstration, I think, of just the strength of public feeling about it all. And it's also important to say this was a moment, of course, of maximum prestige for the US internationally. It had effectively won the Cold War. So even the idea of being taken seriously by the leader of the free world, in fact, the leader of the world, as you might say he was at that time, was extremely important for many of the participants, not least Republicans, Sinn Féin and the IRA, led by Gerry Adams. And then individual Americans played an important part as well, notably, of course, George Mitchell, after whom our institute is named. He came to Northern Ireland at Clinton's behest in a number of capacities before being appointed the independent chairman of the talks. I think it's very important to say that the actual heavy lifting on the substance of the agreement was done more by the two governments and by the parties than by Mitchell himself and his team. But he effectively held the ring, and he insisted on levels of sort of dignified behaviour, which might have been harder to maintain in other circumstances. And also, he was a great communicator with the public about what was at stake. So he played a really important role. And indeed, he came back a year or so later to push the creation of the institutions over the line. He had a very strong team with him. But also, we have to remember there were two co-chairmen as well, a Canadian, John de Chastelain, and a Finn, Harry Holkery. And later on in the process, when it came to the decommissioning of paramilitary weapons, again, there were important figures involved. Marty Ahtisaari, the Nobel Prize winner from Finland, plus Cyril Ramaphosa, the current president of South Africa. So these were all important players. And then the European Union, again, its direct relevance to the talks was maybe not so great, but again, it offered an example, very important to John Hume, of reconciliation within Europe, between France and Germany above all, but otherwise too. And also, it made clear that it would be able to provide substantial funding to support peace and reconciliation. That had even begun before the agreement, but it was intensified thereafter. And there had also been financial support from the US government and indeed from some other governments after the Anglo-Irish Agreement of '85.
Thanks very much, Rory. You mentioned some significant leaders there, President Clinton, Senator Mitchell, and others. Could you comment? My final question for you is, could you comment broadly on the role of leadership, how decisive that was locally, nationally, internationally? How important was the role of particular individuals who happened at that stage to be involved in different ways in the process? Were the individual leaders and their contributions crucial to the achievement of peace, or was it more of a structural process?
Well, I think it was both. I think it was a structural process. The time was ripe for an agreement of some sort, but that was by no means to guarantee that there would be an agreement. So I think leadership actually was crucially important. And looking back at it, even at the time, we thought we were really blessed with the quality of the leaders we had. And I would maybe pick out three different groups. First of all, the British and Irish Prime Ministers, the British Prime Minister, the Irish Taoiseach, they had worked closely together going back to the early 90s in the persons of Albert Reynolds and John Major. John Bruton continued. And then, luckily, at the start of the peace process, we had a British Prime Minister in Tony Blair and an Irish Taoiseach in Bertie Ahern, who were both young leaders who had been elected very recently, had considerable domestic mandates, and therefore freedom to act in a way which hadn't necessarily been there for previous governments, in particular British governments. Secondly, there was huge intellectual leadership given by the SDLP, in particular, Social Democratic Labour Party, under the leadership of John Hume, but with extremely able colleagues, and notably Seamus Mallon, his deputy leader, Mark Durkan. Hume, if you like, emphasised the importance not just of peace and dialogue. He conceptualised the structures which were eventually put in place. He saw the importance of the US dimension. So he was crucially important to this. But thirdly, I think there would not have been an agreement. I mentioned earlier that the doubts one might have had over the willingness of Republicans and Unionists to make peace. And I think here you had, on the side of Sinn Féin, with Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, two leaders who, with great subtlety, some would say cunning, managed to manoeuvre their movement into a position where it would accept peace and a settlement well below what they might have hoped for over many years. And secondly, David Trimble as the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, whereas the usual tendency of unionist leaders was to say no, Trimble saw that strategically it was essential that unionism engaged with the process, and he was prepared to take really serious risks, which ultimately culminated in his overthrow as the leader of unionism. But I think Trimble was hugely important, maybe less credited with all that he should be, but so were Adams and McGuinness, but also the Irish government and other leaders as well.
Thank you, Rory. As ever, I feel like I learn so much when I'm listening to you speak. And the Northern Ireland peace process, for all of the flaws that some people see in it, is an extraordinary testament to what can be achieved. And when we look at the news around various conflicts in the world, to take hope from and learn lessons from those things that happened in Northern Ireland is, I think, a really important thing. It's been great today hearing the insights on the basis of your expertise and involvement and deep reflection. So thank you very much indeed to Rory Montgomery.
Thank you, Richard.